They didn't agree that the Qur'an was coherent. And we're going to come across that very shortly. So I thought it was important in those papers to argue back and say, well, actually, there is some coherence, even though you may not necessarily see it in the Qur'an, there is an element of coherence. So what we're going to do is that we're going to firstly go over the problem itself, like who says the Qur'an is incoherent? And then we're going to go over, okay, how do we respond to this allegation? And what's the Islamic position regarding this? But I'm not going to just look at those Muslim scholars. I'm going to be also looking at even Western academics who sympathize with the idea that the Qur'an is coherent. So the first thing is, oops. Down? Okay. Oh, okay, down. First of all, who considered the Qur'an to be incoherent? There's quite a few orientalists, generally people who studied Islam in the West are considered to be orientalists. Some orientalists have sympathies with Islam. Some of them are quite harsh in their critique regarding Islam. And this goes back a number of centuries. So one of the first people to say this was an individual by the name of Thomas Carlyle. He wrote this a couple of centuries ago, where together, that's fine. But the reason why he did it is that he did it in order to undermine the Qur'an, and he did it so to show that the Qur'an was in actual fact incoherent. Now, how was the Qur'an revealed? This is a very important historical background that we need to go through before going into or responding back to the likes of Richard Bell and others. Because part of the reason why they felt that the Qur'an was incoherent was because the Qur'an was revealed in a particular way. What do I mean by this? First of all, the Qur'an consists of 114 chapters and is revealed over a 23-year period. So unlike previous scriptures that are attributed to different prophets of different religions, such as the Torah of Moses or the Injil of Isa alayhi salam, which was revealed in one go, the Qur'an was different. It was revealed over a period of time. It was revealed over a 23-year period. So they're saying that if you are going to, one of the reasons why the Qur'an was incoherent is because it was revealed over such a long period of time, and when they had to compile it, it was just all jumbled up. The Qur'an was compiled by the companions of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, different to the sequence it was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ, meaning that the way that the Qur'an was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ, it's at odds with the way that it was compiled. As we know, one of the first verses to be revealed to the Prophet ﷺ is in actual fact at the end of the Qur'an, which is in Surah Al-Alaq, Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq. Recite in the name of your Lord who created. This is towards the end of the Qur'an. And one of the last verses to be revealed to the Prophet ﷺ is near the beginning of the Qur'an. So the sequence in which it was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ was very different to the way that the companions compiled it. Now, there is a long discussion about the ordering of the Qur'an. There is complete ijma' or consensus amongst the Muslim scholars who say that the verses within the surahs of the Qur'an are in order. Okay? But there's a difference of opinion regarding the order of the surahs of the Qur'an. Okay? So they say that, example, the order from Fatiha, Baqarah, Al Imran, Nisa, which are the first four surahs, this is not necessarily from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's difference of opinion on whether it is or whether it isn't. And this session is unfortunately out of the scope, but what I will say is that the strongest opinion seems to be that it was inspired by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to put it in this order, because they were looking at, for instance, the Prophet ﷺ said, put this verse in this surah that is related to the ayat, but with regards to the tartib or the ordering of the surahs, then it is something that the Prophet ﷺ generally would recite in order during the salah. And then there was consensus amongst the Sahaba who would actually say that it begins with Fatiha and it ends with Nas. Okay, so there's some difference of opinion regarding this issue, but at least the vast majority of scholars in our time, they would actually say that it is an issue of something which is called tawqifi, which means that it was inspired or is divine. And it's not something which is ijtihadi, which means that it was the scholarly effort that the Sahaba put forward in order to come up with this ordering. Also, some chapters were revealed in its entirety, while others were revealed gradually. So, some surahs, short and long, were revealed in one go. Okay, so Surah An'am, which is 160, 170 verses, it was revealed in one go to the Prophet ﷺ. So it comes as one unit. Surah Al-Ikhlas was revealed in one go. It comes as one unit. But then the problem, or the so-called problem, lies in the fact that some chapters of the Qur'an, such as Surah Baqarah, it took around 9 to 10 years for it to be revealed in its entirety. One of the first verses to be revealed in the Madani period, which is the second half of the life of the Prophet ﷺ as a prophet, which lasted for 10 years, the first verses was from Surah Baqarah. And one of the last verses in the Madani period was Surah Baqarah. So it took around 9 to 10 years for the whole of the surah to be revealed. So this is another argument that could be used as to the reason why the Qur'an seems incoherent from the orientalist side. Also, was the current ordering ijtihadi or tawqifi? We've actually covered that already, and we said that the current ordering, the strongest opinion is that it is tawqifi. And the reasons we're not going to go into because it's really out of the scope of this discussion. Now, the Western perspective is lacking in linear continuity, right? What does linear continuity mean? We're going to come across that very shortly, inshallah. But it basically means that there is no real coherence in the Qur'an. By the way, if you want to ask questions during the session, please go ahead. Clarifications, it's also not a problem. I apologize for I just got a bit of a cough, so I'm just sucking on some medicine. Okay, how did those who say that the Qur'an was incoherent, how did they classify it? The first way is they did it in two main ways. And these two main ways, the main people behind them was an individual by the name of Noldake, who died in 1860s or 70s, and Bell, who translated the Qur'an in a different, rearranged way in 1937. Now, the first one, Noldake, he arranged the Qur'an chronologically. And interestingly, he wasn't the first one to do this. There's at least been about 4 attempts from Orientalists to actually do this. And his one was the most successful or the most popular. And in actual fact, when he actually did this, it was actually part of his university dissertation. And then about 30 or 40 years later, one of his students, named by the name of Shwali, he actually re-edited it and basically it was republished under Noldeke and his student Shuali's name. Another way is for it to be interpreted thematically, and this is what Richard Bell did. So he basically looked at the flow of the verses and he said, look, this doesn't make sense. You know, why is it that Allah, he talks about the day of judgment in Surah Al-Qiyamah, and then he completely talks about something very different. لا تحرك لسانك لتعجل به. Why do you recite in a very quick way? What has this got to do with the day of judgment? So he would put these kind of verses under a different part of the Qur'an. Now, again, this thing about interpreting it thematically is not a problem in and of itself. Even rearranging the Qur'an chronologically is not a problem in and of itself. We actually find a number of Muslim scholars doing this. There's at least about 4 or 5 tafsirs of the Qur'an that have been chronologically arranged, meaning that the first surah to be explained from this tafsir is Surah Al-Alaq, and the last surah to be explained is either Surah Ma'idah or Surah An-Nasr. So there's not a problem with rearranging the Quran chronologically, but it's really the intent behind it. So the intent behind it really, in terms of rearranging the Quran chronologically and thematically, was there to undermine the Quran and to show that it hasn't got coherence. Those scholars who did rearrange, Muslim scholars who did rearrange to explain the seerah through this way, but also to see if there is any patterns that he could actually come across, right? But as a side point, it wouldn't be completely accurate because not all surahs were revealed in one go, and really when they were doing it, rearranging the Quran from surah to surah from a chronological perspective, it wouldn't be fully accurate because some verses of that particular surah were revealed later on. So if they wanted to be more accurate, then they would have done it from verse by verse, which is a lot more difficult to do. Now, both scholars attempted to reconstruct have actually, in actual fact, said. Now, why did they feel that the Quran to be incoherent? One of the main reasons why these Western scholars fell into this error is because they didn't understand the Quran on its own terms. This is really, really important. The reason why is because there is something called Aristotelian Western logic versus Semitic rhetoric. Okay, so this is basically the way that we speak in English, the way that people speak in Greece and in Italy and so on and so forth. It's the way that we construct arguments even is according to something that is called the Aristotelian or Western logic. I'll give you an example. Whenever you write an essay, or whenever you write a book as an example, an essay, let's take an essay as an example, it would have a certain flow, a linear flow to that whole essay, right? So the first thing is that you'll have the introduction, and then the second thing is that you'll have the problem. The third thing is that you'll have you're counteracting that problem by arguing against that problem, and then you'll have a conclusion. That is usually the way that an argument is constructed in something which is called the Western logic or Aristotelian logic, right? Now the Semitic logic or rhetoric is something different because the Arabic language is considered to be part of the Semitic family of languages, as is Aramaic as well, which is in which the Old Testament, the New Testament is alleged, or even the Injil is alleged to be in that language, which is part of the Semitic language. They have a different system. They don't have the system that we are familiar with in the West. And what they would do is that it would actually rely upon something which is considered to be symmetric or a ring composition type of argument, right? So this individual is very interesting. A guy called Michel Kuipers. He's from he's alive. He's a Western academic scholar, and he actually specializes in the Bible, but he's also written some books in the about the Qur'an as well. I think he's a Catholic. Most people from Belgium are Catholic, I think. The Netherlands is Protestant, and I think the Belgian are Catholic. Now, he's written a couple of books. He's written a book called An Explanation of Surah Al-Ma'idah, which is really interesting because it talks about Christianity. And he's also written a book called the Qur'an Composition. Most of these books are written in the French language, and they've been translated into the English language. He's written other books as well. There's another book that he's written on the what he called the apocalyptic chapters, which are the Juz Amma, or the last few surahs of the Qur'an. Now this is what he says. He says, we can further note that the Qur'an has a way, which is often very obvious for those who know to look, of handling Semitic rhetoric, the sudden changes of subject, sometimes interrupted by central verses, and then continued the frequent changes of person, traditionally known as the term iltifat, a leap from the divine we to the third person, for example, are all indicators of the text's division. They make the framework visible under the skin of the text. Okay? So here is a Christian, non-Muslim, who's basically saying that there is a difference between this Aristotelian Western logic that we are familiar with in the West, and the Semitic rhetoric that the Qur'an is more familiar with as well. And this is quite interesting because in light of what he said, 1860s or 1850s, when Nordeke wrote his book on the history of the Qur'an and other works that he's done, is that he says that the Qur'an brusquely interrupts one subject to jump to another, which it will also abandon to return to the first. So he's actually admitting that it just doesn't make sense that the Qur'an jumps from one topic and it's talking about one thing, then it goes and talks about something completely different, and then it goes back to the first topic. So he's actually understanding, without knowing what Semitic or Greek logic, Aristotelian logic is, he's at least recognizing that there is some kind of returning back to the topic that was discussed before, right? Now, Kuipers, in his book on Surah Al-Ma'idah, he argues against this notion when he posits, despite appearances, we can say that the whole of verses 1 to 11 of Surah Al-Ma'idah is solidly constructed in a coherent manner, on condition that we make the effort to understand this coherence in terms of Semitic rhetoric, not according to modern Western criteria which come from Greek rhetoric. So here is a person who's actually saying, who's arguing against this idea of this Aristotelian Western logic, the way that we see things. The point is, going back to the very first bullet point, is one of the main reasons why these Western scholars fell into this era of understanding the Qur'an to be incoherent, is because they did not allow the Qur'an to speak on its own terms. Okay? Now, who do we know? So what we're going to do is that we are going to look at who has argued the Qur'an to be incoherent, and how do we respond to those who say that it's incoherent from two main perspectives. Okay, so we're probably going to cover the first perspective just before Maghrib, inshallah, which is the thematic part. The chronological part we'll probably look at after Maghrib, inshallah. Okay, for the thematic, it's quite clear that it's the Prophet ﷺ said in many verses, many hadith, when the verses of the Qur'an were being revealed, he would actually say that put this verse in this surah and put these verses under here, and so on and so forth. And if he did not do that, at the very least, he would recite it in the salah, and their companions would realize where these verses are. Right? So there was a clear aim as to where these newly revealed verses would go. Second of all, Fakhruddin Razi, who is a 6th century scholar, Hijri, 6th century scholar, 7th century scholar, he wrote a very famous tafsir called Tafsir al-Kabir. He often says the reason why this follows that is because of this reason, right? There is a reason why a particular verse is being put next to another verse, and there is actually another individual by the name of Imam Biqai, Burhanuddin Biqai, who was I think 11th, 12th century scholar. He was considered to be one of the students of Ibn al-Hajar al-Asqalani, the very famous scholar who explained Sahih al-Bukhari. He wrote a book called Nazm al-Durar, right? And this whole book, which is about 10 volumes long, he looks at the reason why, or gives the benefit or the wisdom why one verse is right next to another verse, right? So for instance, we look at Surah Al-Baqarah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the beginning of Surah Al-Baqarah, after talking about, giving an introduction, what is the Qur'an and so on and so forth, that there's no doubt in it and so on, and these kind of things. Then he talks about the believers, and then the disbelievers, and then the hypocrites. Then he talks about Adam alayhi salam, then he talks about Musa alayhi salam, then he talks about Ibrahim alayhi salam. Then anyone who's actually reading, they're thinking, why is it being jumping from this topic to another topic to another topic? What is the link between all these prophets and their stories? What is the link between all these things? So he is one of the scholars. He wrote his whole tafsir based on trying to understand or understanding the wisdom behind these so-called jumps in these topics, right? Or these so-called inconsistencies, or why is the Quran seeming coherent? What is the link between these things? Anyway, he said, if one reflects on the connection of each sentence to what follows it and to what succeeds it, but fails to uncover the implicit connections, one will see the text as no more than unconnected discrete themes. So there is actually a science that talks about the link between this verse and the verse that comes after it. Okay, now there are a number of scholars who actually discuss these things even before the likes of Noldeke came around, Thomas Carlyle came around, and for instance, Imam Suyuti has written a whole book on the link, the relationship, the munasaba, in Arabic is called munasaba, between the beginning and the ending of the chapters. But one of the best books written on this topic is Samarati. His father Samarati is an Iraqi scholar, and what he did is that in a very small book, he basically does whatever Suyuti does, but he actually adds a few more things as well. So in not only talking about the beginning and the ending of the chapter, what he also did is that he looked at the relationship between the beginning of the surah and the verses, the last few verses of the previous surah, and he does that throughout the whole of the Quran. Also, in actual fact, Imam Suyuti wrote 2 books on this topic. Also, Farahi and Islahi, they looked at the relationship between the groups of chapters with others. So they had a theory that the first 7 chapters they represent something, and the next 10 chapters they represent something, and the next 20 chapters they represent something, and these different groups represent different stages in the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, this debate has been of interest to modern Western scholars such as Mustansir Mir, Raymond Farron, and Kuipers. Mustansir Mir, he wrote his PhD on the Tafsir of Islahi, which was written in the Urdu language. Raymond Farron is a recent Western academic scholar. He has written, what he did is that his background is looking at Jahili poetry or even Arabic poetry, and he came across these ring compositions in Arabic poetry, and then he said, okay, let me try doing this on the Quran and see if it actually works. And it seemed to have worked. And then also Kuipers, he did something similar, but he has a certain agenda in that he believes that the Prophet ﷺ was inspired by the writings of the Bible, because the Bible actually make these kind of ring composition techniques, because Aramaic is a Semitic language, and he must have taken this from the Christians at the time. So he has actually got an agenda, Kuipers, in terms of his understanding of the reason why they actually did this. There are many other scholars. In actual fact, I was in a conference, like a closed conference about 3 years ago in SOAS, where some of the main scholars, Western academic scholars, they were discussing the different aspects of coherence and so on and so forth. It was a really fascinating conference. But unfortunately, 2 or 3 people, really important people, in actual fact, these 3 people, they didn't come to the conference for whatever reason. Maybe they weren't invited, or there's some kind of clash. But there was other scholars such as Neil Robinson and others, Professor Abdul Halim and others, who were actually at this conference. And it was a really interesting conference talking about how the Qur'an, whether it's coherent, incoherent, and how do we explain all of these different things. So Kuipers and Mayet, who's another scholar, have suggested that Semitic logic takes on various forms. So they actually propose 3 main forms of this. The first one is called parallelism, right? So something is parallel. So you have paragraph A, paragraph B, paragraph C, and then in the second half of the chapter, it does it again, A, B, C. Is that quite clear? Yeah? I'll come up an example in the next slide, inshallah. And then there's something called concentrism, which is A, B, C, D, X, and D, C, B, A. The X meaning that this is the central verse, and this is the main aim or message of the surah. You'll find the main message of the surah in X, right? And then also, I don't know how to say this word, chiism. It's basically like a mirror. So A, B, C, D, D, C, B, A. And they say, Mustansir Mir and others, Raymond Farron, they argue that Surah Yusuf is actually constructed in this way. So for instance, if we look at Surah Yusuf, there's 6 main elements, or 6 main parts of Surah Yusuf. The first part is that Yusuf alayhi salam had a dream. He had a dream. Then what happened is that the brothers, there was a confrontation with the brothers, and then the wife of the Aziz tries to seduce Yusuf alayhi salam, and then so do the women. Then the king has a dream, Yusuf alayhi salam goes to jail. Right? There's 6 things. These 6 things, they reveal themselves in the opposite order in the second half of the surah. And what is that? The last thing that I mentioned is that he was in jail. He refuses to come out of jail and to interpret the dream of the king until he can find out what those women accused him of and whether they were actually right. And then once the truth was established that it wasn't Yusuf alayhi salam trying to seduce them, but they were trying to seduce him, the wife of the Aziz came out and she basically said, okay, the truth has come out, I'll basically say yes, it was me who was trying to seduce him. Then the confrontation of the brothers happened in the beginning of part of the surah, which is episode number 2. The penultimate part of the surah is the confrontation subsides, and it begins with the dream of Yusuf alayhi salam, and it ends with that dream becoming a reality. Right? So Surah Yusuf, in some respects, is like a mirror. You put a mirror in the middle, and everything that happened in the first half of the surah, it happens in the second half of the surah. And here is also another example as well. An example of concentrism. So this is Raymond Farron. He came up with a really amazing paper, right? It's probably one of the best papers I've read on the concept of munasabah. By the way, Raymond Farron's Muslim. So he said that the first 20 verses of Surah Al-Baqarah is talking about faith versus unbelief, just like the last 2 verses are talking about it. Then verse 21 to 39 is talking about Allah's creation, as is the penultimate part of the surah. And then 40 to 103, as 178 to 153 is talking about deliverance of law. And then 104 to 141 and 153 to 177 is talking about being tested. And then the central verses is about the Kaaba being the new Qibla and so on and so forth. What's actually amazing about this paper is that within each ring composition, so let's just say that A is a ring, he finds another ring within there. So from verse 1 to 20, he'll have another diagram showing that there is actually another ring composition taking place. So he not only found a ring composition in Surah Al-Baqarah, but he found within each ring another ring composition. And it's actually a really amazing paper. Whether you agree with it or you don't agree with it, that's not the point, but the point is this is an example of what they consider to be concentrism. There is a problem though. There is a paper by an individual by the name of Nicholas Sinai. He was actually at that conference that I was talking about. He wrote it in 2017. I think the conference is in 2016. Maybe he was inspired by attending it, I'm not sure. He responds to this idea of the ring composition by Kuipers and Farron, right? And he geniusly called his paper Going Round in Circles, which I thought was amazing. Such a good title. So what he argues is that there have been similar claims that have been made before. So it's not necessarily organic. So he's like saying that Farron is not coming up with anything new. Kuipers is not coming up with anything new. What they're basically doing is that they're piggybacking on other people's works, and they're just trying to come up with something which is not necessarily, strong from an evidence base, right? So this is one of the arguments that he makes, although it's not a major argument, but he does say this. He also questions the Western Semitic logic. You know, when I was talking about Aristotelian logic and then also the Semitic logic, he said it's not that binary. He says if you look at the Greek, one of the Greek classics like Homer's Iliad, it's actually written in a way that would be considered to be quite Semitic in its style because of the ring compositions and whatnot. So he said it's not black and white the way that the Kuipers is actually making out. Also, he says he questions the methodology of Kuipers and his application. He basically, what Kuipers does is that he actually has a very sophisticated system on how to divide the set of verses and how to divide the surah. And he basically says, he starts poking holes in his methodology by saying, look, the same thing, the same theory that you use, I can come up with a whole set of other verses as well. Another thing is that he says that there's inconsistencies in section markers. So when Farron example came up with a verses 1 to 20 as an example in Surah Al-Baqarah, he will say that in another paper that he wrote in Surah Al-Baqarah, he basically completely changed the verses. So why do you have it in this way, and in another set of another book he had it in a different way? So these are his arguments that he uses in this paper that came out a couple of years ago, and this is important to understand so that if we are going to be mentioning their names, and we're kind of trying to defend the Qur'an and so on and so forth using these people's names, that we need to also understand what the critics have also said about their papers and their works. So rejoinder basically means in the Arabic language a rad, right? Like a refutation. So my problem with this is that the conclusions do seem to be organic. The conclusions of Kuipers and Farron, they do seem to be organic. So Sinai in his paper, he basically said that because what Farron did, when we're talking about Surah Al-Baqarah, that image that we looked at before, where there was that ring composition of Surah Al-Baqarah, he does exactly the same thing with the whole of the Qur'an, which is quite amazing. So he says that Surah Al-Fatiha is connected to Surah Nas. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, he talks about Allah, he talks about Rabb, he talks about Malik. In Surah Nas, he talks about Qul a'udhu bi rabbin nas, Malikin nas, Ilahin nas. Right, so there's actually a connection between Surah Al-Fatiha and then Surah Al-Nas, right? Surah Al-Baqarah, there's a connection between that and the second surah of the Qur'an, which is Surah Al-Falaq. It talks about the evils of man. It talks about the evils of man in Baqarah. It talks about magic, Harut and Marut in Surah Al-Baqarah. It talks about in Surah Al-Falaq, it talks about the witches and the magicians who come up with knots. So there's clearly a relationship here. Surah Al-Imran, which talks about the Christians, and it talks about Isa alayhi salam. In Surah Al-Ikhlas, which is the third surah on the back of the Qur'an, it talks about how Allah is Ahad. He's not got a son, right? So all of these things, he actually does this for the whole of the Qur'an, right? So he said that there is another individual who has done in Western academia, an individual by the name of Julian Aldrich, which I haven't actually read. It's quite difficult to get hold of his book. But he has actually done something similar. And he said that Raymond Farron didn't know about this book. But you know what? He did know about Biqai's book, because Biqai does exactly the same. Biqai actually says that Biqai actually does this in his tafsir about 400 or 500 years ago. And I actually, before reading this paper, I actually emailed Raymond Farron and I said, did you know that Biqai said this? He said, no, I didn't know Biqai said this. So this argument about these similar claims have been made before, so it's not necessarily organic. It seems a bit of a conspiracy theory, right? So you're getting different individuals from different times who are coming up to the same conclusions that the Qur'an is coherent even from that kind of framework or that example that was mentioned. There is a different structure unfolding in the Qur'an. Yeah? Even if we don't want to use the Western versus Semitic logic, the Qur'an certainly has its own logic. The Qur'an certainly has its own logic, and its logic is unbelievable, right? I'll give you an example. Actually, I won't give you an example because we need to break for Salah soon, right? But we'll revisit this in a moment. Someone just remind me the next after Maghrib, just if you can just remind me to talk about the different type of logic that the Qur'an has. But certainly, whether we want to talk about it being Western or Semitic logic, it's very clear that the Qur'an is quite distinct in its style. In terms of its structure, is very different to the way that a Westerner would write, the way that other people will write. So let's just say that even if Sinai is actually right on this topic, conceptually the Qur'an has a different type of logic and it has a different kind of system. Oops. Sinai does not discount the concept. This is a very important point. He doesn't. When he criticizes Kuipers and Farin, he's not saying that this is completely wrong, but he just doesn't feel that their argument is convincing enough and for it to be watertight. In actual fact, in his paper, he says, despite the preceding criticisms of Kuipers and Farin, I would consider it very probable that a considerable number of Quranic passages, perhaps even entire surahs, employ a certain measure of a ring compositional techniques, as pointed out at the beginning of this essay. Kuipers' structural analysis are by no means all unconvincing, right? So despite all this whole paper that he's writing in response to the idea of the ring composition that Kuipers and Farin push out so much, Sinai is not saying that it's completely incorrect. Okay? Okay, so we have only covered one part of the discussion, which is the thematic part. In the next session after Maghrib, inshallah, we're going to be looking at the chronological element, right? So the first part is responding to Richard Bell in a conceptual way. I'm not going through examples. If I were to go over examples, I think I need a whole day or 2 days just to go over those examples. But I want you to at least understand it from a conceptual perspective. And after Maghrib, we're going to be looking at it from a chronological perspective, which is Noel Decay's idea that we should rearrange or reconstruct the Qur'an according to the surahs in which it was revealed. Okay, so any questions before we stop? Please just let me mention him as well.
My name is Ibrahim. You've clearly explained how the ayat, the Prophet ﷺ himself ordered and told the companions where to put each ayah. For example, I remember the last ayah, he told them to put it before but the Prophet ﷺ also used to revise the whole Qur'an to Jibreel, and in the last Ramadan he revised it twice, if I'm right.
That's
and
correct.
he would revised it in an order. So he would have started with the surah, following with no surah, and he also taught it exactly in this similar manner to his Kutab, the four or the five. And Abu Bakr, when he was compiling it, he called Zayd ibn Thabit and he told to take from exactly how he would have, and he was one of the Kutab of the Prophet ﷺ. And even before that, Abdullah ibn Abbas has mentioned, I don't know if it's a hadith, but he said that the whole Quran was revealed from Dawah to Bayt al-Izzah, so it would have been intact.
Sure.
According to the chapters and according to the chapters.
Sure.
So is it not fair to say that the ordering of the surah themselves is not by ijtihad the companions, because it would be impossible for the companions to have come up with sort of Fatiha, understandably being the most important chapter, but then to say Surah Al-Baqarah, then to because you can rearrange 114 chapters in a billion ways.
Of course, absolutely.
So
have you got time to answer this or after Maghrib? No, yeah. Okay. So just to
clarify the question, so are we saying?
So the question is that the ordering, not just of the ayah, but even of the surah, is how the Prophet have taught it and to his Kutab, and how.
Just for the benefit of recording, and those who are watching this on stream, is that the question is it not fair to say that even the orders of the surahs or the tartib of the surah is actually divinely inspired, right? Opposed to it being ijtihadi. So it's very important as someone who's teaching this topic that I have to be honest with the knowledge, right? So when it comes to the verses, there's ijma on this issue, complete consensus. So every single verse in a surah is how it was revealed, right? So it's not example, Maliki Yawmiddin, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, as an example. It actually begins with Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, Maliki Yawmiddin, right? That's the way that the verses have actually come down, and that is intact in terms of the way it was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ, right? There's no difference of opinion on this issue. But there are 3 or 4 main groups when it comes to whether the surahs of the Qur'an are in actual fact divinely inspired, right? So there's a group of scholars who actually said it's the complete ijtihad of the scholars, of the Sahaba. They said that it was completely, it was up to them, this is how they did it, basically. And they used some evidences for this as well. Then there's a second group of scholars, Imam Suyuti rahimahullah and others, they basically said that it's between something which is tawqifi, which means it's divinely inspired, and it's ijtihadi, something that the scholars actually put a lot of effort into trying to make sure that this was the closest to how the Prophet ﷺ would want it. And the way that they did it is that the Prophet ﷺ would tend to recite surahs together. So he'd write, so Baqarah and Al Imran together, Surah Al-A'la and Ghashiyah together, because he would recite this in the Salah, in Jum'ah and so on and so forth. So they actually got these 114 and put those surahs which were paired together, and then they started filling in the gaps, right? So this is Imam Suyuti rahimahullah's position. The position of other scholars is, and I may be wrong, but I think it's a majority of scholars, Imam Tabari and others, and a lot of the scholars who actually wrote on Ulum al-Qur'an as well, they said that it was completely tawqifi, meaning that all the way from Surah Al-Fatiha, all the way to Surah Al-Nas, the order of the surahs, not the verses, because that's an issue of ijma, because there's 2 topics, the verses and the surahs. The surahs were divinely inspired. So how, like one of the scholars, he said that the way that it was revealed to the way that it is compiled today in the Mus'haf is the way that it is in Lawh al-Mahfuz in terms of the ordering, right? But just because it's very important for me to be academically honest, I did actually mention that there's no ijma on this issue. I actually lean towards it being divinely inspired. All the surahs, the way from Fatiha all the way to Surah Nas is divinely inspired. Those scholars who say that it's not divinely inspired, they would use a hadith of Hudayfa radiallahu anhu. I think it was Hudayfa radiallahu anhu when he was praying behind the Prophet sallallahu and he didn't actually recite in order, right? So I think he recited Baqarah and then Nisa and then Ali Imran, right? In Qiyam al-Layl. So they would have actually used those kind of surah, those kind of hadith to say that it's not a tawqifi. This ordering is not tawqifi. But Allah knows best. I'm quite convinced by the fact that it is actually in the order, in the way that we have it.
Can I give? I've heard an explanation of this, and one of the explanations I've heard, and I may be wrong, is that this was deliberately done so that a sunnah was not established, that it's haram to recite it out of order in the prayer, in the salah, in case to make it easier for the ummah, that if you recite Nas first and then another surah after it, it's not haram, but the preferred sequence is to recite the other way around. And that's
definitely a response, yeah. But the point is that it's important that we know this, just so someone actually says, well, hang on, there's a difference of opinion about it. And we didn't even know there's a difference of opinion about it, right? So that's the main reason why I mentioned that, inshallah.
Exactly.
Okay, so we're going to stop here. If you've got any more questions, we'll take them at the beginning of the next session, which will be straight after Maghrib. And we'll talk about the chronological. This is a little bit more complicated and a little bit more interesting as well, okay? And I did my whole dissertation on this particular topic, inshallah. So everyone going up?
6:30 back, inshallah.
Okay, so if everyone can be back by 6:30, and the Musalla, everyone's familiar where the Musalla is? On the top floor, inshallah.
Did you happen to get the slides of Hamza last time in the last course? No.
Because
Says that. Okay.
he's very
I'll
protective.
probably email him.
Yeah, what I'm gonna do is, because I think he's still finishing touches on it. He's putting in his new revised edition as well of his book.
Because the problem with me is I can't read this text.
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
so tiny.
Now again.
Even with the specs.
Did you meet him that day in Harrow?
Yes, I met him.
Okay. Did you
Yeah.
talk to him?
Yeah, I spoke to him. He said, look, bro, there's somebody coming from, he had some relatives from, I think, US or Canada visiting him. So actually, he's got some relatives there in Harrow as well.
Mm.
Because you see, this text, even with the specs, I can't even
Yes.
read them.
I'll get the what I'll do.
Even these, I would need the
is-
slides.
Yeah, I'll get you the slides.
Just
the PDF
PDF
format,
ones,
inshallah.
so I can just print it off.
Say something.
Very good.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah.
You'll do another clap test.
Sorry. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Jazakumullah khair for coming back and not running away. So far we've talked about a problem. And the problem is that a number of Orientalists past and present, have said that the Qur'an is inordinate, it's incoherent, it doesn't make sense in terms of its structure. So they've actually tackled this, or they've actually looked at this in two particular ways. The first way is thematic, which means that they've actually taken the Qur'an apart and put it into headings or topics, right? Which is, and then also the second way is that they have changed it chronologically as well. They said, look, it will make much more sense if we were to reconstruct the Qur'an according to the way that it was revealed. So we start with Surah Al-Alaq, and then after this we look at Surah, as example, Surah Mudaththir, Surah Muzammil, or Surah Al-Qalam, whatever order that may be. Like I said, there's not a problem in this in and of itself, because Muslim scholars do this, but they do it for a different purpose and intent. But the way that these individuals did it, they did it in order to undermine the Qur'an, and they didn't do it, they did it in order to show that the Qur'an is incoherent. So far we've actually looked at the way that the Qur'an is coherent from a thematic perspective. We've looked at, example, the idea of wrinkled positions. We've looked at Semitic versus Western logic and the way that arguments are constructed. And we've even looked at a critique of this whole idea by looking at the paper Going Around in Circles by Nicholas Sinai in 2017. But I've also responded to it from a conceptual perspective. All of these things, they still stand the same. It's not a problem. Now, the second argument, which is a bit more convoluted and is a bit more difficult and it requires a lot more explanation, is the idea of chronology. So, Noldeke and Schwally, like I said, Noldeke wrote his book in the 1860s, 70s. It was actually his university dissertation. There's other Western academics who have actually talked about, they've actually reconstructed the Qur'an from a chronological perspective. He wasn't the first one to do this. And like I said, the Muslims have also did this, but they did it in a way with a different intention. And Schwally is his student. 30, 40 years later, he came up with a new edition of his book, and he contributed to it. So they said that the Qur'an was, the way that we have the Qur'an, for instance, Surah Al-Baqarah, Al-Imran, Nisa, and so on and so forth, generally follows a decreasing length rule. So the most lengthy, the longest surahs, they started first and the shortest surahs right at the end, generally speaking. Then you have the chronological arrangement brings up a number of questions. So if we actually look, actually that's incorrect. I shouldn't have written down the chronological bit, but the arrangement of the Qur'an that we have as we have it now, which is Fatiha, Baqarah, Al-Imran, Nisa, and so on and so forth, the way that it is right now, it will bring up a number of questions. And I'm sure you've actually asked this question yourself. Why are there so many long chapters in the early part? Usually, when you have a book, it starts off with the basics, and then it builds up, and you get the longer ones right towards the end, right? That's generally the way that you would expect it to be. Also, why are the first few chapters legislative in nature and not based on belief? Right? And that's a really important question. The reason why that's an important question is because the first surahs to be revealed to the Prophet ﷺ were surahs which were based on belief, right? They're really trying to bring about strength of Iman into the one who's reading them, right? But we find that the first few chapters are very legislative. Like Surah Al-Baqarah, there's so much legislation. It's talking about qisas, it's talking about marriage, it's talking about divorce, it's talking about qasas, it's talking about all of those, fasting of Ramadan, all of those things. Surah Nisa is about inheritance and this and that, just so much legislation in the first few surahs of the Qur'an. Why don't we start off with belief? Also, why is the Qur'an not in chronological order? You know, why is the Qur'an not in chronological order? Why is it in the order that we actually have it? And then finally, what is the wisdom of the order of the chapters of the Qur'an? So these are some of the things that we're going to be tackling over this in this next section. But what is also interesting, and this is actually, it brings about a more of an Islamic discussion related to Taraweeh. So there's, for instance, those masajid that are not able to recite the whole of the Qur'an, then do they have to recite it from Baqarah until where they can reach? So let's just say you can read half of the Qur'an in Ramadan because of the time limits and whatnot. Are you able to, example, recite from, I don't know, for example, Surah Al-Kahf and Surah Nas. Are you allowed to do this? There's a long discussion regarding this, and Allah knows best, there's no problem in doing that. So I don't know why it is that many masjids insist on starting with Baqarah and carrying on all the way to wherever they actually leave off. Anyway, going back to this topic, the prophetic coherence. There is actually a coherence. Unfortunately, Western academics haven't really talked about this in much detail at all, and I'm not sure whether they actually know about the hadith, Allahu Alim, because I've not seen it written in too much in Western papers. The Prophet ﷺ is reported as saying that I have been given the 7th Diwan in place of the Torah, and I've given the Ma'in in place of the Injil, and the Mathani in place of the Zabur, and I have been further blessed with the Mufassir. There is actually another narration, this is authentic hadith. There is also another narration where the Prophet ﷺ said it in this order, but he said after the 7th Tiwal, he mentioned the Mathani and then the Ma'in, then he mentioned the Mufassal. But this hadith is actually stronger. This is the reason why we're using this hadith. So, Noldaki and Shwali's position does hold some weight. When they're talking about the decreasing length rule, there is an element of truth in that. And there's no problem in actually agreeing with them on this. However, it is not just about the length of the chapters, but also the themes. As the Prophet ﷺ, he connected these different 4 sections to different previous scriptures, except for the final one, right? So, the 7 Tiwal in place of, it represents the Torah. The Ma'in is in place of the Injil. And then the Mathani in place of the Zabur. Oh, sorry, it's actually incorrect, sorry. It should be the Ma'in in place of the Zabur. So if you could just correct that in your notes, please. It should be the Ma'in in place of the Zabur and the Mathani in place of the Injil. Sorry, that was a mistake.
So can you explain what's Diwali?
Yeah, we're going to go over that now. So it's not just about the length of the chapters, but also the themes. As the Prophet ﷺ, he connected these different 4 sections to previous scriptures, right? Therefore, there must be a connection between the long 7 chapters and the Torah and so on and so forth. So, what we're going to do is that we're going to go through what do these different sections mean, and then we're going to talk about the relationship that they have with the previous scriptures, right? So let's look at the Tawal. Dawah, basically, scholars agree that the first 6 chapters are the Tiwal. Yeah? So Baqarah, Al-Imran, Nisa, Al-Ma'idah, and An'am. All of the scholars, they agree that these 6 chapters are considered to be from the Sab'a Tiwal. Tiwal basically means long chapter. That's what Tiwal means. There's a difference of opinion, however. Sorry, I forgot Araf. There's a difference of opinion, however, as to whether it should be Anfal and with Tawbah or with Yunus. Right? So they said, what should be the 7th one? Should the 7th one be Surah Yunus or should it be with Anfal and Tawbah? I follow the opinion, and I think it's a very strong opinion, that it's actually Anfal with Tawbah. The reason for this is if you look at Surah Yunus and the chapters that come after it, Surah Hud and others, they all begin with Alif Lam Ra. Surah Hud, and then Surah Yusuf, and then Surah Al-Hijr, if I'm not mistaken, they all begin with Alif Lam Ra. So why are you going to break up that group? Because they have a different beginning, right? So this is one reason why I believe it to be Anfal and Tawbah. But then you may say, and also if you look at the number of verses, Surah Yunus consists of 109 verses, and Hud is 123 verses, Tawbah is 129 verses, and Anfal is 75. But together, if you add Tawbah and Anfal together, it becomes more than 200. And what you notice about generally these surahs, they are very close to being 200, if not 200 verses. Because the next section is called the Ma'in surahs. Ma'in means surahs which are around 100 verses. So Surah Yunus is closer towards the Ma'in surahs than it would be to the Sab'a Tiwal or the 7 long surahs. And also, Anfal and Tawbah contain matters which are more needed by the scholars than Surah Yunus. Because the Prophet ﷺ said in the hadith in Ahmad that whoever memorized the first 7 from the Qur'an is a scholar. And Surah Anfal and Surah Tawbah, they talk about legislation. They talk about jihad, in fact. And this is what a scholar needs more than Surah Yunus, which is generally about stories and reminders and so on and so forth. Now, some of you may be thinking, I'm not sure I've got this in there. I've got this fourth one. Yeah. The fourth one is the chapters identified with each of these sections are consecutive as well. So if you were to put Surah Yunus as part of the long 7 surahs, then you'd have to make a jump, because Surah Yunus is considered to be the 10th chapter. Okay, it's considered to be the 10th chapter. So it makes sense to put 8 and 9 together to make it the 7th. You may ask, however, but hang on, that's not fair. You're putting Anfal and Tawbah together, and they're 2 surahs, and the Prophet ﷺ said they're long 7. This is one of the explanations of the reason why there's no basmala between Anfal and Tawbah. In actual fact, some of the scholars, they considered Surah Anfal and Tawbah to be like one surah. It's not one surah, but they were so closely connected that it was like one surah. Because Surah Al-Anfal, it talks about Battle of Badr, which is the first battle in the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. While Surah Tawbah, it talks a little bit about the Battle of Tabuk, which was the last battle of the Prophet ﷺ. So they're so intrinsically connected, thematically, that it's like one particular one. It's like one surah. Now, the demarcation for ma'in. So the ma'in literally means 100, like mi'ah. The word mi'ah means 100. And the scholars, many of the scholars, there's again difference of opinion. They would say that if it will be from Surah Yunus to Qasas. Qasas is part of a group that consists of Shura, Namal, which all begin with Tasin. And the Shura is 227 verses, although they're very small verses. Surah Namal is 93 verses, Qasas is 88 verses, which again are very close to the 100. Shura, I don't think any of the scholars disagree that it should be under this section, but it seems like there's so many verses, but the length in terms of pages are very similar to the other verses, other surahs. The chapter of Al-Qasas, the chapter after Al-Qasas is Al-Ankabut, which is Surah 29, which is a lot shorter, and it consists of 69 verses. So you see a big drop of Surah Al-Qasas, which is 88, which is closer to 100 than 69. Okay? Because some scholars do actually say that Ankabut should be part of the Mi'ah surahs, but I don't think that's a very strong position. And it also shows you that there's a drop in the number of verses, which should actually demarcate a new section. Baqarah, which begins with Alif Lam Mim, is the first chapter of the Tiwal, and there are other chapters that begin with the Huruf al-Muqatta'a. Huruf al-Muqatta'a are surahs which begin with the letters Alif Lam Mim, Alif Lam Ra, Ta Sin, Taha. So it's actually consistent, because Surah Al-Ankabut, it begins with Alif Lam Mim. But the chapter after Al Imran, which begins with Alif Lam Mim, is Al-Ankabut, which follows the other surahs which begin the same way, which is Surah Rum, Surah Luqman, and Surah Sajda, which all begin with Huruf al-Muqatta'at, which are Alif Lam Mim. Now the next section is called the Mathani surahs. So we're only talking about the demarcations, what surahs are contained within these sections. After that, we're going to talk about thematically. So Yuti Rahimullah mentions that some scholars said that they are chapters that are less than 100 verses. It is perhaps named Mathani because it complements the Ma'in section. Nikwazi states that they are called Mathani, which literally means to repeat something, as they are frequently recited because of the anecdotes that are mentioned within it. And Mufassal surahs, so Mathani surahs, I didn't mention it, it will be some from Surah Al-Ankabut all the way up to the surah that comes before Surah Al-Qaf. So that's 49, that will be Hujurat. Mufassal means interruptions, so short verses. The strongest view is that Surah Al-Qaf is the beginning of the Mufassal surahs because it continues the pattern of each section, which is that all of the new sections begin with the Huruf al-Muqatta'at, which is Baqarah, Alif Lam Mim. Then the next one is Surah Yunus, which is Alif Lam Ra. Then the next one, which is Surah Al-Ankabut, Alif Lam Mim. And then Surah Qaf, which begins with Qaf. Aus ibn Hudayfa asked how the companions would finish the Qur'an in 7 days, because this was the habit of reciting the whole of the Qur'an in 7 days. They said it should be read in the following way: 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13, and then the Mufassal sections. Okay? which means that they would recite the first long 3 surahs, Baqarah, Al Imran and Nisa in one day. And then the following day, they would recite the next 5 surahs. And the following day, they would recite the next 7 surahs. And the following day, 9, 11, 13. So this is an authentic hadith in Abu Dawood and Ibn Majah. So if you were to do this in this way, discounting Surah Al-Fatiha, okay, because Fatiha, you wouldn't really say Fatiha and then Baqarah and Al Imran, because, you know, they wouldn't do it in that way. Then that would mean that the Mufassal section, based on this calculation, would begin with Surah Al-Qaf. Okay, so like I said, it's clear they didn't include Al-Fatiha in this calculation in order to make the number of chapters easy to remember using odd numbers. Okay, if we were to look at the whole of the Qur'an in this perspective, the majority of the Qur'an is a Tiwal. Yeah, that accounts for, you can say, like 1/3. I suppose the blue section, the Tiwal, the long 7 surahs, is considered to be the 1/3 of the Qur'an. Ma'in is a little bit shorter, Mathani is a little bit shorter as well, shorter than the Ma'in and the Mufassal. So there is actually an element of the decrease reading.
So, just to interrupt.
Yeah, that's fine.
So, Ma'in definitely comes before Mathani.
So there's 2 narrations on this.
Yeah.
Tiwal, Ma'in, Mathani, Mufassal. Okay? Then,
Which is the authentic one that you said.
yes, then there's another hadith, which is Tiwal, Mathani. No, sorry, I made a mistake. Tiwal, Ma'in, Mathani, Mufassal, all the narrations that as far as I'm aware of, they actually agree with this order. But the 2 narrations, the only way that they differ is that they say that the Ma'in is like the Zabur of Dawood alayhi salam, and the other narration says that it is the Injil of Isa alayhi salam. That's the only difference. So they say that the Ma'in is laser working. No, it's not. The Ma'in, okay, is in one narration it says the Ma'in is like the Zabur of Dawood alayhi salam, and it says the Mathani is like the Injil of Isa alayhi salam. Whilst the other narration, which is a bit weaker, says that the Ma'in is the Zabur of Dawood alayhi salam, the Injil of Isa alayhi salam, and the Mathani is the Zabur of Dawood alayhi salam.
So Ma'in, Dawood, stronger.
Yeah.
Mathani, Isa,
Stronger.
weaker.
No, Mathani, Isa stronger.
He's also stronger.
Yes.
Mathani, Isa, yeah.
Yeah.
Because on your slide it's...
Yes, it's incorrectly done. I did the weaker one, which is incorrect. It shouldn't have been there.
So it's Ma'in, it belongs to Zabur and Dawood.
Yes. And the Mathani is Isa and Injil. Yeah.
Isa.
That's a stronger opinion. The stronger hadith.
And this is the stronger one.
Yeah.
Okay, got you. Alright.
Is that clear? Okay.
Is that clever?
Okay, so let's look at the Tiwal now, but from a thematic perspective, right? From a thematic perspective, how does the Tiwal relate to the Torah of Musa alayhi salam? Most of the rulings are found in Islam are found in these 7 long surahs. Most of them. The topic of taqwa is cited more than anywhere in the Quran, 120 times, more than any other section that is mentioned in the Tiwal section. Why is taqwa so important when we're talking about rulings in Islam? Because this, as we find in Surah Al-Baqarah, was the biggest problem of the Bani Israel. That they would be acting, doing legislation, but they did it, they were bereft of doing it from a taqwa mentality. And in order for our actions to be done in the correct way, it has to require the idea that we are conscious of Allah Jalla wa Ala, of his punishment. All the chapters in this section are Madani, with the exception of Surah An'am and Surah Al-A'raf. So this is a majority Madani section, which you would expect because it's full of rulings. There are many themes found in this section, but the leading ones are giving da'wah, iman, 5 pillars. In actual fact, this is the only place where all the 5 pillars are mentioned. Nowhere in any other section are the 5 pillars mentioned, because the fasting of Ramadan is only mentioned in Surah Al-Baqarah and nowhere else in the Qur'an, right? And you'll find verses of Hajj in here, you'll find zakah, prayers, and also even the first pillar of Tawheed as well. When a person has been guided to Islam, they are looking for actions to prove their faith by performing acts of worship. It's not so much of a question as to why, but how. And this is the reason, or the hikmah, that we can take from the fact that the first few surahs of the Qur'an are legislative of nature. And when we're not necessarily making a bio-dichotomy by saying that only rulings of Islam are mentioned in this section, because there are many verses which relate to belief. But the Makki surahs, which are towards the end of the Qur'an, they tend to be more of a belief, ukhrawi, akhirah kind of centric kind of stance leaning towards it. Then we get the Ma'in surahs. Don't know why it didn't come up one by one. But Ma'in are chapters in this section that exceed 100 verses or more. They're distinguished by the many stories mentioned therein, such as Yunus, Hud, Yusuf, Ibrahim, and the last chapters of this section is called Surah Al-Qasas, which means the story. So there's so many sections within these verses, these surahs, which relate to stories. The main themes of this section are the signs of Allah, Allah's knowledge of the soul, signs of the world, and verses about history. So the whole section is related to reminders, wisdom, benefits, and lessons, which are similar to the content of the Zabur of Dawud alayhi salam. Most of the verse surahs in this section are Makki of nature. That's how it correlates with the Zabur. Then we have the Mathani surahs. Many of the chapters are similar to the Tiwal, since the Injil confirmed the content of the Torah. The distinguishing feature of this section is a consistent discussion of the Akhirah, which is not too different from the contents of the Injil, which also talk about zuhud, asceticism, keeping away from the dunya, and so on and so forth. Most of the chapters in this section are Makki, because you have to remember that around there's about 83 to 84 surahs of the Qur'an which are Makki, right? And there's about 24, 25 surahs which are Madani. Now, if we're going to put this in terms of, that's in terms of the number of chapters, but if we're going to put it in terms of the length of Qur'an, then that is basically around 17 juz, which are Madani, and 13 juz, which are Makki, right? The main themes in this section are a deep discussion of Iman, Akhirah, and to remember Allah, and we are introduced to 11 new names of the Akhirah, which do not appear in other parts of the segment of the Qur'an, which is Yawm al-Azifa, Al-Ba'th, Al-Tanad, I think that's a mistake there, Al-Jum' Al-Hisab, Al-Khuruj, Al-Khulud, Al-Fath, Al-Fasl, Al-Wa'id. All of these names are names of the Akhirah. And we're going to talk a little bit about the hikmah behind that as well shortly, inshallah. It further focuses on cultivating a methodology that inspires crucial qualities such as patience in the face of tribulation, steadfastness, calling to Allah, glad tidings, and warnings, and also jihad as well. The last section, which is the Mufassal section, is a distinguishing features is the variety of the opening verses. The main themes in this section are reminders about what has already been mentioned, so there's nothing new. Because if you actually look at the hadith itself, this is the only section which doesn't correspond to previous scriptures. It says the Sabah Tiwal is related to the Torah, the Ma'in surahs are connected to the Zabur of Dawud alayhi salam, the Mathani is connected to the Injil of Isa alayhi salam, and then the Prophet ﷺ said that I was preferred with the Mufassal. So it's not connected to any previous scriptures, but it's actually just reinforcing what came before. The Prophet ﷺ, he's an embodiment of this because he's not coming up with anything new, he's just reconfirming everything that's actually been mentioned in previous scriptures. Also in this section are 7 new names mentioned in this section about the last day. Al-Waqi'ah, Al-Taghabun, Al-Haqqa, Al-Qari'ah, Al-Tama, Al-Sakha, Al-Ghashiyah, and 4 new names for the hellfire, Al-Ladha, Al-Saqar, Al-Hawiyah, and Al-Hutama. The Mufassal does not come up with anything new, but only comes to summarize what has come before. It can be argued therefore that this segment represents a summary or a foundation of the entire book. And subhanAllah, there is a statement of Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah. He said that there is a narration that the scholars mentioned that there was 104 scriptures that were sent down to the previous prophets. So there's about 104 different types of books. And all of this can be summarized in the Torah, the Injil, and the Furqan. And all of these three books can be summarized in the Furqan. And the whole of the Furqan, it can be summarized in the Mufassal surahs. So you can say that the whole foundation of Islam, of the Qur'an, and everything that is mentioned previously in the whole, all the previous scriptures, it can be summarized in this section, the Mufassal section. Again, which is really fascinating. Why? Because these are the surahs that we have been recommended to recite in the Salah. Because from Surah Qaf to Surah Nas, the scholars have divided up what surahs that we should recite at Maghrib time, and what we should be reciting at Fajr time, what we should be reciting at Isha time, which are a bit longer surahs, and all of them are from the Mufassal sections. In actual fact, when the very famous, I think it may come up, the very famous narration where the Prophet ﷺ was leading the Isha Salah and Mu'adh ibn Jabal radiallahu anhu was praying behind him, and the Prophet ﷺ led him in Salah. Mu'adh ibn Jabal radiallahu anhu goes and leads a Salah, Isha Salah, for his local community, and this one man is really upset with him because he takes so long in the prayer, and he says, I'm going to complain. And Allah Jalla wa Ala refers to Dawood as having this hikmah. Where do you generally gain lessons? You gain it from stories, experience of other people. And this is under this particular section. Then you have the Mufassal section. There's similarities between the Tiwal and the Mufassal. And in that the foundation of the religion can be found here in terms of pillars of Islam and Iman. There is greater focus on Islam in the Tiwal, whilst Iman is more apparent in the Mufassal. Islam represents the outer actions, whilst Iman in the inner. The beauty of this contrast is further apparent in that most of the chapters of the Tiwal are Madani, where the focus on legal law in society was predominant, while most of the Mufassal are Makki, where the focus was on creedal matters. So it is beautiful how they go hand in hand. It is this inner faith that is required on a daily basis. Hence, there is a wisdom in instructing Mu'adh ibn Jabal radiallahu anhu to lead lead the people in prayer with the Mufassal chapters. And I think that I haven't done this, but there probably needs to be a study as to why, what is so relevant, or what is the connection between these different sections within the Mufassal surahs and the prayers that we actually pray. So for instance, we know that in Fajr and Isha Salah we're supposed to read the Diwal surahs of the Mufassal section. The longer surahs from the Mufassal section, the scholars are actually saying that we should do this at Fajr time and Isha time. And then Surah Maghrib, Salat al-Maghrib is a bit shorter. Is there a connection between these different salahs and also these different things? But what is interesting is that we all need a daily dose of Iman, and we get this daily dose of Iman from these sections, these Mufassal sections that we recite in the Qur'an, from the Mufassal section that we recite every day in the salahs that we pray every single day. There is clearly a strong emphasis on the Akhirah, in particular the Day of Judgment, in the Mathani, Mufassal, both which represent the last two prophets. Right? It's incredible. Because you get the Mathani chapters, and then after they get the Mufassal chapters, these are last two prophets. Do you remember what was actually mentioned in the Mathani, in the Mufassal sections? New names for the Day of Judgment. New names for the hellfire. It's like there is a culmination of everything that's coming up in the Qur'an, in the Mathani and the Mufassal sections, and this is actually reminding you more and more and more of the Day of Judgment, more and more of the hellfire, because after these reminders there's nothing else. So the subject matter has now shifted as their arrival is a major sign of the nearing of the Day of Judgment. And the Qur'an begins with the story of Adam alayhi salam, the first prophet, which is found in Surah Al-Baqarah, and it ends with the segments of the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the final prophet. In actual fact, the last few surahs of Juz Amma, you can make it into a seerah. Surah Lahab, Surah Fil, all these surahs, all of these surahs in the last part of Surah Juz Amma are all connected to the seerah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam.
Brother, just a quick point, if I may. I mean, this is all the internal coherence of the Qur'an, this last bit. Is it worth mentioning, going back to this Aristotelian logic thing, where you mentioned that they start with an introduction, what are you going to say, the body, say it, and then conclusion, tell them what you've just said.
Sure.
And the Qur'an, at a very surface level, does in fact follow that. It does have an introduction in terms of Fatiha, the opening of the Qur'an, kind of hinting what is the rest of the book going to contain. You've got the middle bits, and then the Mufassal is a conclusion of everything that's just been said.
Yeah,
it's just a thought I'm sharing.
Yeah, no, it's a good point, and I don't think there's anything that can actually discount that. So that's the reason why I feel that you shouldn't actually necessarily fall into the whole Aristotelian and the Semitic thing. You can mention it; it's not a problem, but from a conceptual perspective, the Qur'an has a higher level of logic, right? And in actual fact, just to demonstrate how incredible this logic is, or the higher form of this structure is so incredible that actually I think I talk about that later on, so I'll leave that. But just because I said that I'm going to mention it, so I think I have actually got that in the slides. But yeah, definitely.
Just at a superficial level.
No, you're right, absolutely. And that's actually coming up next. From this hadith about the Sab'a Tiwal, the Ma'in surahs, the Mathani surahs, the Mufassal surahs, where's Fatiha in all of this? Because Fatiha is not mentioned. One chapter that has not been given much attention to our discussion is Fatiha. It's not mentioned in the hadith, and it's not even indicated because it's not part of this. It's not part of the Sab'a Tiwal. The Prophet didn't even identify as being part of the Sab'a Tiwal. Why is that? That is because Fatiha is in actual fact the summary or the introduction, as you were mentioning, of the entire Quran. When you have the beginning of any book, the first chapter is not the introduction. The introduction comes before the first chapters, right? So there's it's like this is actually a summary of the Quran. One of the names of Surah Al-Fatiha is Qur'an al-Azim. It represents the whole of the Quran, and that's what Fatiha actually does. So rather than actually saying Fatiha as being the opening, you can even retranslate that as meaning the introduction or the summary. And this is clear from what Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah said. When we were talking about that long statement that I said, that it has been said that Allah has revealed 104 books and all of them can be summarized in the Torah, the Injil and the Furqan, and all of these can be represented in the Furqan, and all of that can be represented in the Mufassal surahs. It actually carries on because it says all of that can be combined, the meanings of all the previous scriptures, the whole of the Quran can be represented in Surah Al-Fatiha,
And then it even goes further by saying all of the whole previous scriptures and the whole message of all the previous prophets can be summarized in one verse, and that is إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. You alone we worship, and you alone we seek help and assistance. Now, distinct features of the structure of the Qur'an. I want a bit of interaction now because I've been speaking a long time and my throat's starting to hurt. Okay, so I want you to speak with the person next to you and talk about the distinct features of the structure of the Qur'an. You can talk about the stuff. Oh, actually, is it on your papers? Yeah. Oh, okay, don't look at it then, please. Okay, turn that paper over, don't look at that paper, and I want you to discuss it, think about it, and come up with some ideas as to what are the distinct features of the structure of the Qur'an which are different to other scriptures or even other books. And some of them we've already done already. And you've got 2 minutes, inshallah.
Obvious in this way. It has a flow, but I'm not deep below. You have to appreciate it.
Okay, you got 1 minute.
You're absolutely right. It doesn't start with once upon a time and finish with the that sequence, which is a Western sequence. But it does have its own in the beginning it starts
Did Dawud have Islam come up? I think that's I think the truth is for what it is. Can't impose your this is the Qur'an, this is Allah. Try and understand it for what it is, and then basically open your eyes to what it is. It's always inviting you to open your eyes. And the mystery is inside it, not the surface level. It's a bit like a present or a gift that's been wrapped up in tinsel. You know that there's something inside it. It looks very attractive from the outside.
Okay.
It's only when you open it and look inside.
Can we have... okay guys, if we can have some feedback please. So the group in the back, Jerry and Ibrahim, I think it is. Just mention just one thing.
In the few minutes you gave us, we basically said that whether you're talking about the Aristotelian logic or the Semitic rhetoric, these things are both like sort of man-made classifications.
Sure.
Whereas the Qur'an has to be above and beyond this.
Beautiful.
And the brother made a very good point that if people are sitting in some room 1,000 years from now, doing what we're doing now or attempting to do what the scholars have done, they may even have another system to compare to. He says the Quran still has to remain above and beyond.
Excellent, very good. So it's got a completely different type of system, and there's something very unique about the way the Qur'an has actually been revealed. In actual fact, there's only one book that I've ever read that actually follows something even close to similar to the way that the Qur'an has been structured, and not even, it doesn't even come close to it, but anything even like very faintly in terms of its structure. And the interesting thing is, it's one of the most popular books ever written, right? Does anyone know what I'm referring to?
The Bible.
No, not the Bible.
Would it be Sahih al-Bukhari or something like that?
Don't be sad. If you look at Don't Be Sad, it's written by Ayat Qarni. It's a bit controversial who actually wrote it because anyway. So what he does is that he actually repeats quite a lot. And he repeats quite a lot. There's no proper structure to it. I'm not comparing it in terms of the structure of the Qur'an, but anything faintly, like even slightly comparable in terms of the repetition and so on and so forth, you actually find in Don't Be Sad. Allah Akbar. Next group. Just one thing, please.
I was comparing that, a gift, whether it be a special horse or a special car or a brand new house. The nature of a gift is that it's very pleasing on the eyes, but it's only when you engage with it over a period of time you realise whether it's good. But you've got to take it for what it is, and then the impact it has on what you need to do with it. So the horse, you take it for what it is, you realise it might be temperamental, and you think, well, that's not very good, or it might not be very healthy, it might not be very fast, it doesn't function according to, and same with the car, and same with the house. You might realise the paint's peeling off, the heating is always lost through the windows, and it's actually not doing its purpose. Whereas, and you can use that analogy with anything in life, something that looks very appealing as a gift. But the Qur'an, in the way it draws you in, is through its sound. And unanimously, you can agree the sound is a beautiful sound, and it draws people in. And that's this drawing you towards a gift. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the Qur'an as his gift. And it's only when you open it, read it, look, take it for what it is, you realise it's functionally absolutely relevant to you.
Sure.
And I think that's something, sometimes it's the way it's been written, it's meant for you and your life.
Excellent. Any other points? You had
we said that basically most books follow like a pattern of like chapter 2 is related to chapter 1, as in it's carrying on something like a story, but with the Quran it's like Surah 1 would have nothing to do with Surah 2, it's different. It's completely different.
Yeah, nice. Like it. That's just, you want to mention anything?
Well, I actually remember something from a tafsir lesson that the teacher told us once, that the ending of each surah does have something as a type of introduction that the next surah will be discussing.
Yeah.
So I'm not really sure. I don't have any evidence for
Sure.
it.
Okay, very good. So let's look.
Yeah.
It doesn't start like other books where it says once upon a time, then you ends with like in history where you have a date, it carries on from once upon a time to the end.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. Yeah.
Can we also mention the fact that it also matches our aql, which is a metaphysical thing. So the aql, it wonders about, and as you're reading the Quran, it also wonders about the same. It basically takes you where you are and where you're going. So in that sense, it's also timeless. So at whatever moment in time that you are or live, whether you're happy or sad or whatever, it corresponds to your innate feelings and to your innate emotions and reasons and whatever. So it doesn't lose you as much, because it wanders with you.
Sure.
It goes with you. Like.
Interesting. But let's go through some of the points which are in your notes. The first one is the structure makes the Quran relevant. What I mean by this is that whenever you have a standard book, let's just look at an example. Let's look at a textbook. You won't find too much repetition in there. In a textbook, you won't find too much repetition. In actual fact, you'll find that if they want to repeat something, they won't repeat it in too much detail, and they'll basically say in the footnote, go to chapter so-and-so. But the Quran doesn't do that. It actually repeats itself, and what it does is that it basically makes the whole of the Quran relevant, in that it's not something that you can skip. The Quran is so profound that it makes every single part relevant. So let's just say as an example that, actually that's another point. The second thing, so the point is that the second point is that it pushes the reader to keep going back to the Qur'an, right? So sometimes it asks a question and then it answers it in another part of the Qur'an. Someone's thinking, okay, yeah, but how do I understand this? And maybe I can find out the answer, and you'll find that answer on later on in the next few pages or something along those lines. One classic example of this is Surah Al-Anfal. Allah Jalla wa Ala says, يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْأَنفَالِ قُلِ اللَّهِ وَلِلرَّسُولِ, that they ask you about the spoils of war. Say that it belongs to Allah and the Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then it goes on to say that they are believers who, when the Qur'an is recited, then it makes them have like fear of Allah and so on and so forth. But it's not actually answering the element of spoils of war. And the spoils of war is not answered until 40 verses later, which is amazing in Surah Al-Anfal. So it actually doesn't, and there's a wisdom behind that as well, which I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because it's not really the scope of this course. But the point is that it really tells you to go back to the Qur'an over and over again. And it also tells us that we shouldn't be taking it for granted, and the more and more we actually look at the Qur'an, the deeper we'll be able to understand it, and it's not something that you can read just once. And I'll go back to this point shortly as well. The chapters are generally in decreasing order. So again, this is, I'm not familiar with any book of history which actually has something similar to this. There is actually a good book called How to Read the Qur'an by a Western academic by the name of Carl Ernst in America. And he said that when he teaches the Qur'an to his non-Muslim students, he's non-Muslim himself, he says, I can't understand why does it begin with Baqarah and then it ends until Surah Nas. And what I do is I've actually changed the syllabus where I actually start off with these verses, these surahs first, and then I go over these surahs next. So he's actually restructured the Qur'an, not in the same way that Noldeke has done, but he's not doing it because he feels that his students don't fully understand it. But the problem with this is that there is actually a wisdom behind why the Qur'an has been revealed in this particular way and why it should generally be read in this particular order. Not to say that you can't read it in another order, but there is actually a stronger wisdom behind this. One of the reasons is because, and I think I'll mention it now, is that, for instance, if we're looking at Surah Al-Baqarah is really very powerful because it's the first surah to be revealed in the Madani period. Prior to, this is the first time, now the state has been established in the Madani period. A lot of legislation is going to start coming, right? A lot of do's and don'ts, harams and halals are going to come. And it's really important that we approach this revelation and also subsequently the Qur'an in a particular way. And the way that we should avoid approaching the revelation is the way that the Bani Israel do it, that are mentioned in the beginning part of Surah Al-Baqarah. So it's actually very profound the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins with Surah Al-Baqarah, right? And that is that we need to approach the Qur'an in a particular way. We don't approach it in a way that we are saying to our Prophet, are you taking us for a joke? Why are you asking, why are you making, you can ask questions, but don't ask those questions in a mocking kind of way. It's really there to prepare us as an ummah on how to receive revelation and in particular the way that we should approach the Qur'an for the next few chapters and so on and so forth. So this is just one example. The next one is, it has a higher form of logic. It's actually very powerful because what we should anticipate is a different multifolded, a higher form of logic in which reveals itself in diverse forms. The more and more we struggle with the Qur'an, the more and more we're able to engage with the Qur'an. I'll give you one example. The Qur'an is so powerful that maybe there's a surah that we've memorized, and even verses within the surah that we memorized, and then we're reading a book, and one scholar, he mentions that verse that we memorized in a way that we've never understood it before, and it seems like we are reading that verse for the very first time. Yeah, I'm sure a lot of you have actually come across this. I've definitely come across that. And it's like the Qur'an has this incredible ability of being able to re-reveal itself. That it has this multifaceted understanding, meaning that transcends anything that is earthly, that once we understand it, we don't have to engage with it again. And this is one of the powerful things of the Qur'an, in that it was structured, and I think I'm going to mention it. Yeah, the Qur'an has been. Do you want to mention this next? The Qur'an has been structured in a way that you read it regularly. Because most books, when you read it, it's only supposed to be read once. But the Qur'an has been structured in a way that you're supposed to read it regularly. And this actually brings us back to the next point, and that is the Qur'an is theme-driven and not chapter-driven. What that means is that unlike a textbook, a chapter is divided into specific topics. The Qur'an is distinctive because it's not chapter-driven, but it's theme-driven, because every single chapter revolves around a particular aim, and all the verses, they revolve around that aim. So it's theme-driven from that perspective. And what it does, it allows the major goals to be embedded into the text regularly. So what I mean by this, let's just say that you are going to a course, this course is 10 weeks long, and these 10 weeks is based on a book that has 10 chapters. So you're going to the first chapter, the second chapter, the third lesson, the fourth lesson. You know the fifth lesson, you've missed it out. And the teacher says, because you missed the fifth lesson or the fifth chapter of the book, which is really important, then you need to go on. You need to learn this before you can go on to the sixth chapter or the sixth lesson, because it's like a prerequisite. But the Qur'an is so powerful that even if you miss one part, Allah Jalla wa Ala knows that we're not going to read the whole of the Qur'an in one day, because it's something that we need for our daily life. So what He's done is that He's embedded the major goals of the Qur'an in every other page. So even if you read the Qur'an in 2 or 3 pages, you're able to get the main message of the Qur'an. And you can't say that for any book. And that's what makes the Qur'an so incredibly powerful, is that it is theme-driven and not chapter-driven. Even if you have only read, for the day, you've only read 4 or 5 pages of the Qur'an, then you can still understand the whole of the Qur'an, even though you haven't read the whole of the Qur'an. Because all the major goals of the Qur'an are embedded in every other page. That's how powerful the Qur'an is. Because if the way that other books are constructed, if you don't read a crucial part of it, you won't understand it. And in this respect, another way of actually saying it, and you have to excuse my crude language, I'm not saying it in a disrespectful way, but this means, if we understand that we can get the main messages of the Qur'an within a few pages, this goes back to the first point, how the structure makes the whole of the Qur'an relevant. Or another way of actually saying this is that it makes every aspect of the Qur'an really juicy, right? In the sense that there's nothing that you can skip. You know, when people just skip pages, the Qur'an is so powerful that you can't skip the pages, because it's just too enticing, too amazing, that that's the way that the Qur'an has been constructed. And this is one of the reasons, subhanAllah, that this idea of the Qur'an being really juicy, really powerful, really amazing, is that if you do a survey and you ask people, okay, what's your favorite chapter of the Qur'an? You're always going to come with different answers. Some guy's going to say Surah Al-Rahman, some guy's going to say Surah Al-Tawbah, someone's going to say this. They're going to come up with 114 different answers, right? Because that just shows you, that's a good example, a good demonstration of how powerful the Qur'an actually is. And subhanAllah, Allah Jalla wa Ala mentions something similar to this in the Qur'an, where He says, الله نزل أحسن الحديث كتابا متشابها مثانية تقشعر منه جلود الذين يخشون ربهم ثم تلين جلودهم وقلوبهم إلى ذكر الله. That Allah says, Allah has sent down the best of statements, a book, its parts resembling each other in goodness and truth, oft repeated, which causes the skin and the hearts of those who fear their Lord to tremble, and the skins and the hearts soften as the mention of the mercy of Allah. Also, the idea of repetition is only being accustomed to our need. So what I mean by this is that how many times has Salah been mentioned in the Qur'an? Loads of times. Dozens and dozens and dozens of times. Because Allah knows that we need a reminder of the salah. Because there's so much of the ummah, they don't pray. But how many times has he mentioned fasting? He's only mentioned fasting in the Qur'an once. The fasting of Ramadan once. And you're going to get the whole of the ummah fasting. I mean, that's exaggeration, but the point is, you'll find loads and loads of Muslims, people who don't even pray for the whole of the year, they'll come out fasting. And that just shows you how, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is repeating things if there is a need for repetition. And if there's a need not to mention something over and over again, you'll only need a reminder once, right? Also, it develops a holistic character due to the Makki and Madani structure dynamic. You notice that, the Makkan surahs, the ones which were revealed the 13 years of the Prophet's life, and then the 10 years that were revealed in the Madani period, they have distinct characteristics, and they were addressing particular individuals, particular people, and particular errors, and so on and so forth. And they develop a different part of your character. But what we notice is that all the Makkan surahs are not gathered together in the Qur'an, and not all the Madani surahs are gathered together in the Qur'an. But what's actually happening is that we are constantly, through the order of the surahs of the Qur'an, are developing different characteristics throughout the whole of the Qur'an. So you're going to go through a whole set of Madani surahs, and then you're going to come out of there and go through the gardens of Makkan surahs, and then you're going to come out of there and you're going to go into Madani garden, and the Makkan garden, and the Madani garden. So what's actually happening is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually developing our character in different ways from a Makkan and a Madani perspective. So there is a holistic character that is actually being developed. Because the mindsets are very different. The Makkan and the Madani mindset is very different. And what Allah Jalla wa Ala is trying to do is that He's trying to develop well-rounded individuals by the Makkan and Madani paradigm. But also, there is certain shifa found in the Makkan surahs that are not found in the Madani surahs. And there's certain shifa that is found in the Madani surahs that are not found in the Makkan surahs. And we are in need of all of that shifa because the Qur'an, all of it is shifa. Finally, the conclusion. The conclusion, going back to the prophetic arrangement, understanding the Qur'an with this prophetic arrangement helps to answer many questions related to the wisdom of how the Qur'an was compiled. It is clear from this paper or from this session that the Qur'an is not incoherent, but is beautifully structured, and we can even go further to posit that the Qur'an was compiled chronologically. How can we do that in this way? Because not chronologically from the angle that the first verse of the Qur'an revealed to Muhammad is found in the beginning, but that each section represents chronological progression of scripture. Because the Sab'a Tiwal, Musa came with the Torah, which is represented with the Sab'a Tiwal. And a prophet that came after him was Dawud alayhi salam, came with the Zabur, and he represents the Ma'in. And then the penultimate prophet of Islam, Isa alayhi salam, came with the Injil, which represents the Mathani. And then also the final messenger, Muhammad was favoured with the Mufassal, and and the summary of the Qur'an is Al-Fatiha. And then this is also kind of reminding us of the coming of the Day of Judgment, because it is the last final prophet. So in that respect, we can say, just as Muhammad is an embodiment of all the prophets that came before him, the Qur'an is an embodiment of all the previous scriptures. And that's how the Qur'an is coherent from a chronological perspective and also from a thematic perspective. So that's the end of today's session. If you have any questions, please go ahead. Or forever hold your peace.
So as you said, like there is a higher logic in reading the Quran from the order it is present now. But can we, if there is someone whose belief is not strong, can you advise him to read Mufassal chapters first and then go to the...
Yeah, there's no problem in that. I'm not sure that when I mentioned this before, maybe I mentioned this before Maghrib, but there's a discussion among scholars that when you are, example, reading Taraweeh as an example, and they cannot complete the whole of the Quran during the month of Ramadan,
then can they, and a lot of masjids, what they do is that they start off from Baqarah and then they go up to Surah Al-Kahf if they can only do 15 juz, or can they do it in different orders and choose and whatnot. There's actually no problem with actually choosing that. In actual fact, the functioning of these particular surahs as a reading of a book is very powerful, but for the functioning of the salah, I'd actually argue there's no problem with starting with the Mufassal surahs as an example. Like for instance, you know when someone's really trying to increase khushu and so on and so forth, most people would get more of a khushu and more of a connection by reading verses related to the akhirah, the day of judgment, the hellfire, the paradise, more than example verses of inheritance in Surah Nisa, right? That's just the way that most of us are wired, right? So there's many scholars who've actually said there's no problem in terms of if you cannot complete the whole of the Qur'an in Tilawi as an example, you can just change it. It's not an issue at all. And Allah knows best.
Could I ask, are you going to have any more sessions like linking all the different miracles of the Qur'an in terms of, say for like example, the miracle of the Arabic language and
we may have some
things like that. Did you ever do things
Yeah,
along
so
those lines? So bringing
yes.
it all together kind of thing in terms of proving the miracle of the Qur'an.
Yeah, so I am going to be working on this. Just so you know that I work for IRA and I'm part of the education research department. And what we're doing, my role is to basically look at to see if there's any gaps in arguments and discussions and narratives in the Dawah. And two have been highlighted. The first one is prophethood. And for the last few months I've been looking at just on prophethood, because generally in the English language, when we're looking at prophethood, it just tends to be from a miracle perspective or from an akhlaq perspective. So we have to. I'm actually looking at it, taking it from beyond that. In actual fact, it's funny that you asked this question because I've literally just finished my research on this, and I'm starting to write the paper on this. And now I've started to look at the Quranic argument as well, and I've started to read up on it. And it's really interesting. So for instance, this example about the Quran being eloquent and the miraculous nature of the Quran. Like one of the things that I came across, which I found really interesting, is if we say that the Quran is eloquent, then we can say many books are eloquent as well. Shakespeare's eloquent. So what's so incredible about the Quran? So one of the arguments that the scholars actually use is that in order to become a specialist and become a master in something, there's a number of journey that you need to go through. You have to have a teacher, or you have to go through many failures, and you have to put a lot of effort, right? So if we look at Shakespeare and look at his history, his biography, and look at the things that he went through, it didn't come out of nowhere. Like the Quran came out of nowhere for the Prophet ﷺ, because he didn't have that background, as an example. So if you actually even look at as an example of the different types of books that people actually write, sometimes it's a compilation, sometimes it's like a critical edition, or it actually may even be a unique book. The Quran is a unique book in that perspective, and it's more difficult to come up with something like that. So I am actually looking at the miracle of the Quran and looking at the argument from that, and maybe in the future I'll do that, inshallah. But I'm actually very early stages, literally just started last week, researching on this topic of the miraculous nature of the Quran and what makes it miraculous. So we'll do a specialist series on that in a few months, inshallah.
On that note, is it worth mentioning maybe an expose or on the satanic verses and how they came about, and how should we argue against people who try to contest the miraculous nature of the Quran with the infallibility of the Prophet?
Sure. Yeah, that's a possibility. I mean, we're kind of, so there's two things that we need to do. We're either responding to arguments that are already out there. I don't know if the satanic verses is a big argument that's actually used, but we may even
use it quite a bit.
Or we may even maybe be proactive in that respect and say, okay, this may come up, and when the issue appears, then we'll actually respond to it. We're actually doing that with another topic, actually.
What about the issue of Aisha?
Yeah, I think that's been done.
Has that been
Yeah,
done?
that's been covered a lot actually. There's some really good papers out there. There's one by brother, what's his name, the translator, Ayman. Then there's Jonathan Brown did a video on this
Right, okay,
a
yeah,
few
yeah,
years ago. So I think that's been done. But I think yeah, I think there's been enough work done on this topic. Allah.
I think the way this structure is, I mean, it's safe and it's quite authentic and it's actually based on hadith as
Yeah.
well. And like you said, it's both thematic and chronological.
That's
But
right.
it's quite broad. It divides the Quran into four or like 5 sections if you also include the Fatiha.
Sure.
But can we safely say any other way of trying to argue that of the Quran's structure, whether it's the chapters or the ayat, and like base it on the Aristotelian or the Semitic way, are conjectures and fallacious because they do not fit into both.
Sure.
Other than what this particular way.
Sure.
Can we-
Yeah, definitely. This one is, and this is the reason why I did this last, because I felt that there is actually some strength to the Semitic logic that Kuipers and Farron actually push out, but it's not necessary because Arabic. We have to be frank here. Arabic is part of the Semitic family, right? So I don't think there's a problem with using it, but I don't think Sinai is actually correct in saying that there's not been enough research in being able to determine what are the distinctive features of this. And it's important that we don't project our own theories onto a particular framework that's actually out there. But this one is for sure safer, and like you correctly stated, that it actually deals with both. It deals with a chronological perspective, it also deals with a thematic perspective as well. And there's actually incredible, as you notice, that there's actually incredible like inner secrets, amazing things that we can actually derive from that one hadith by comparing it to the previous scriptures, but also looking at how everything has actually how it's been constructed as well. And it's also safer than the group system that Islahi and Farahi actually came up with, because that seems a little bit contrived, to be fair, where they had a theory and they tried to push the surahs into that theory. Here we have something which is authentic, a hadith that is authentic, and we can build up from there.
Second.
One of the reasons people, Muslims especially, find it difficult to study the Quran is because of this difference from what they're used to studying as far as texts written in that follow Aristotelian logic. And we're used to it through just growing up and studying that way. So based on the understanding of the coherence of the Quran, how would you say that should shape our study of the Quran? Because how should we therefore approach it so we can better study and understand it better? Any tips or suggestions on that?
Yeah, so one of the wisdoms that we take away from the fact that the Quran is being constructed in this way, which I say in inverted commas seems incoherent, is that, and obviously is coherent, is the fact that we just engage with the Quran. And that's really important, because I think Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with the wisdom of the reason why the wisdom why the Quran was constructed in this way, and why sometimes there's topics that go from one to another that don't seemingly seem to connect, is for us to ask that question, like what is the connection between this chapter, this section of the chapter, and the next chapter? Why did Allah mention it in this way? What is the connection? So I think one of the ways is for us to engage with it, and I think this is that's from more of a surah perspective, from an inner surah perspective, from a micro perspective, but from a macro perspective, in reading Baqarah all the way to Surah Nas in terms of that structure, I think that again there's great benefits doing that as well. And it may not seem that clear to us on the first reading, but sometimes I don't know so many, but I know a number of people who have become Muslim just from reading Surah Baqarah, right? Because they read Surah Baqarah and they're really like amazed by it, and they just became Muslim. There's one brother I went to college with. He said, I read Baqarah, I just found it amazing, became Muslim. I think Sinead O'Connor said something about Baqarah recently as well. She said she read Baqarah and something. I think she said something along those lines. So I don't think we necessarily have to tell people to non-Muslims or even Muslims to read it from a different part of the Qur'an, because it they fear that it's going to be legislative, too legislative, or they're not going to get it. I don't think we need to do that. I think there's no harm in doing it, but I don't think we should push it, because, like I said, we should approach the Qur'an on its own terms. Don't project our own experience, our own thinking, the way that we've been brought up, our own kind of education upon the Qur'an and say, look, this doesn't make sense, this looks a bit strange, I've never come across anything like this in my life. Just read the Qur'an with an open heart. And this is something that's a formula that's been winning, right? Because over the centuries, people have been reading it and they've just been mesmerized and amazed by it. Labid, one of the people who was considered to be one of the greatest poets at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, he said that when Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anh, he said, recite some poetry for us. And Labid, he said that when I recited Surah Baqarah, I've forgotten all of my poetry because Baqarah just mesmerized me, So I don't think we should be scared of even kind of like reciting it in the way that it's been structured as it is. But like I said, the wisdom behind its structure sometimes pushes us to ask questions, because the Qur'an makes you think. Qur'an constructs people. It constructs people of substance, and that can't happen if you don't think.
There's another story of somebody reverting just by reading just that ayah.
Yeah, it's such an incredible beginning. It's an amazing beginning. Yeah. لا ريب فيه سبحان الله. Any more questions, comments, clarifications?
As far as in translation now, so in the Arabic, these things can be studied, and the scholars are studying these things in detail, and the coherence and developing these views. The average type of Western non-Muslim or even Muslim who doesn't know enough Arabic, can they still appreciate some of this in translation? Which translation would you recommend, which may capture some of this? Are there any? What's your take on it?
Yeah, so the major miracle of the Qur'an is not necessarily the linguistic element of it. The main miracle of the Qur'an is its message, in terms of its tawheed, in terms of the laws and legislation that's in there, and the main message is trying to put forward. That is a main miracle that people don't tend to talk about from a miraculous kind of nature. So that is not lost in translation.
Sorry, brother. How do you mean that's? How do you mean talking about legislation is miraculous in the same way that linguistically it certainly is? I didn't understand the difference.
So, for instance, when people talk about the miracles of the Quran, they tend to just talk about it from a linguistic perspective. They think, oh, look, it's amazing, the words that are used, the ring composition and the structure, it's really phenomenal. But they don't realize that when you're talking about a book, you're talking about like Shakespeare, you're not just talking about how great Shakespeare was and the way that he presented it, but it's actually the story that he tells, the content. So likewise, the main message or the main miracle of the Quran is what Allah is trying to convey to us. Because you may appreciate the language, you may think, wow, this is beautiful, nice, it's not going to make me Muslim, but what makes you Muslim is the substance, what Allah is trying to convey to humankind. That's what is the miraculous part. The content, the message of the Quran is what is the miraculous part of the Quran. So when I'm talking about the legislative aspects, any aspect of the Sharia, which is mentioned in the Quran, it's very powerful. It's really amazing. For instance, the marriage and divorce system in the Quran is just incredible, just amazing. That even non-Muslims will appreciate it. Some of these things have actually led to people, revolutionizing mathematics. Khwarizmi, he said that when he was going over the verses of Surah Nisa or inheritance, he said he found it so complicated what did he do? He came up with algebra, right? So it makes you lead on to coming up and thinking and moving forward. And the basis of that was something that was contained in the Qur'an. So I feel that the main message is not necessarily lost in translation. You know, you can get any decent translation, but the ones that I recommend, the ones that I feel that are really good, at least giving it to non-Muslims, I think Mustafa Khattab's one is probably one of the best ones to giving it to non-Muslims, because you have to understand that a translation of the Qur'an, it fits different purposes, and it's written for different audience and different people. So I feel that his one is the best one to give to non-Muslims, because it gives like a title for each verse, it's nicely laid out, he explains things in a very nice way. Generally speaking, in terms of a flow and just trying to read cover to cover, because what we tend to find is that a lot of the translations, they're very dense in that it's very difficult to read all of it. But in terms of something being reader friendly, I think one of the best ones is Professor Abdul Halim's one. From a stylistic perspective, I think Dawah Khalidi's is excellent, because he used indents in a very powerful way. I think his one is really good. So I think even when I'm actually putting verses together and trying to find the right translation, I tend to use those three and try to come up with some halfway measure, because not all of them, there's not one which is like the best or the amazing one. But I've actually found that it's actually two or three which are really good that I just tend to kind of compile together. So those three I'd actually say are really good.
Could you just repeat that again?
The first one is by Mustafa Khattab. You can
Clear
get
Qur'an.
the Clear Qur'an, Mustafa Khattab. You can get that from Amazon.
It's not. I think it's just starting to become available on Amazon and eBay, but it's mainly more available in America and Canada and places like that. But you can still get it online, I think.
Yeah. If you need copies, maybe we can try to sort it. Are we going to try to get some from one of the brothers who go to Canada?
Yeah, we have some copies, but they're for Dawah purposes specifically.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
we can't give them to Muslims.
The second one, which is very easily accessible, is Oxford University Print by Professor Abdul Halim. That's ABDELHALLEM. Professor Abdul Halim from Oxford University.
He has his translation's been done into Audible as well now.
Oh,
Written in a really nice voice as well.
Who's narrating it?
Someone maybe related to him, I think. It's
okay.
Halim as well. Someone that's.
Ayman, that may be his son.
Yeah,
his son. Okay.
It's a brilliant narration.
Yeah, he's got a nice voice. The third one is, I think it's by Penguin Classics. His name is Tarif Khalidi, and he's a Palestinian American academic.
What's the name?
Tarif Khalidi. His name is Tarif Khalidi.
Penguin Classics.
Yeah, Penguin Classics. Yeah. But the good thing about Khattab that I really like is that you generally find that Qur'an translations tend to be solo projects. But his one was it was overseen by a board. Some of them including non-Muslims, who all through this journey end up becoming Muslim, which is amazing.
Three non-Muslims.
So sorry, not all of them became Muslim, but I think two out of the three. Yeah, 2 out of the 3 became Muslim.
And is there any particular formatting, i.e. footnotes, or is it just a simple translation all the way through? Or
so one of the things that people tend to get put off by, which I certainly do, are the number of brackets that you have within a verse. I think there was even one where the whole of the verse was a bracket, which is ridiculous, right? I think that you do actually have footnotes in this one. The way that Khattab used the footnotes is very clever, because he has very small kind of indent footnotes, brackets, so they don't even look like horrible upon the eye. Abdul Halim, he avoids brackets, but he's got, in each of them, they've actually got they've got nice sections explaining some aspects. So for instance, Abdul Halim's got 3 pages on the life of the Prophet, which I find to be amazing. I think in those 3 pages you capture the whole of the life of the Prophet in a very summarized way. So if you were that would be like an example of a matan of a seerah. You could actually study that. He summarizes it that well. That's in the introduction. So yeah, in those books you tend to find like explaining backgrounds of Islam. There's a paragraph in Abdul Halim's translation for each surah explaining how, what is it Madani and what is it talking about and so on and so forth. So it's quite good from that perspective, yeah. In actual fact, I was maybe thinking that maybe doing a session on the different translations of Quran, but I don't know whether it's going to get that much of a, if it's going to be that popular or if it's really that needed. But maybe we'll do it. I'll do it in the future. We're looking at different translations and how they've evolved and how different they are and what the good features about this translation and that translation. And maybe we'll do that. We'll see what the appetite is like.
The Quran it's like a gift, like the person keeps giving, and it's secrets to those who like frequent like reading it. Of course. Did you find any relationship with the structure and with those muqatta huruf, like alif lam mim, ha mim, ta sin is repeated several times? And also maybe another side question. On the Quran's linguistic aspect, even the mushrikeen of the past, when they hear the Quran, they used to shake or they used to run away from it or whatever. And today we have a lot of us who understand the Arabic language or speak Arabic language, or even our Arab brothers. I'm not in any way diminishing the iman or faith, but when we hear the Quran read to us, or even in translation in the English language, it doesn't affect so much the heart. But that's a side question. On the muqatta, is there any relationship with those muqatta huruf and the structure of the Quran?
Yeah, the question is there a structure or any pattern that we find with the surahs which begin with huruf with muqatta? Interestingly, I think I wrote a paper as part of my master's for this as well, and there does seem to be a relationship. So, for instance, the Hawamim is very clear. So the Hawamim, the surahs that begin with Hamim, they talk about 4 or 5 different things which are consistent throughout all of the surahs. They talk about Musa salam and his confrontation with Fir'aun. They talk about giving respite to the disbelievers. They talk about preparation for like not being not having the non-violent, non-jihadi surahs. Because there's an emphasis on Dawah. There's actually a number, 3 or 4 different themes. Also the surahs which begin with Alif Lam Ra, you notice that generally speaking they all talk about prophets. So for instance, Surah Yunus, Hud, Yusuf, Ibrahim, they all begin with Alif Lam Ra. So they're either named after prophets or they're talking about prophets, like Al-Hijr as well. They talk about prophets or they're named after prophets, so there's actually a relationship there. I think there needs to be more done in this field, because I don't think there's many, it's not really talked about in terms of a structure. There's about 29 surahs in the Quran which begin with huruf al-muqatta'at. I think there needs further study on this. I've not actually come across anything which has got a very comprehensive study on the patterns, but there certainly seems to be some kind of pattern.
Is there any strong suggestion as to the meaning itself, or that's been left out?
So
there's
2 main opinions. The first opinion, and this is the majority opinion, that there is a meaning, but we don't know what the meaning is. So the meaning is only known by Allah. And then the second opinion, which is the opinion of Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu and others, is that there's varying opinions as to what those things mean. So there may be abbreviations for the names of the Qur'an. So Alif Lam Mim, that would mean Allah, Latif, and then Majid, which are the names of Allah, and it may mean different things. So there is actually a whole load of different explanations what that actually means. Allah knows best. The second thing that you mentioned?
The effects of the Quran.
Yeah, how can we get a stronger relationship with the Quran in terms of it affecting us? It's just to engage more and more with the Quran. So there's different levels. The first thing is that we need to read the Quran, listen to the Quran. The second level is to understand what was actually in the Quran. And then the third level is to kind of like make the tadabbur of the Quran and also memorize as well. So these kind of 3 or 4 levels, this will actually help us to feel like a stronger presence when it comes to the Quran. If we do this, then I feel that we will have a stronger connection with the Quran for sure.
Sister, you had a question?
I want to know that is there any way of us finding about these talks more centrally? Because I just come across them randomly and I don't know if I've missed any. Is there a central mailing list or anything to be informed of?
For which talks?
For the talks that are held
The
here by
seminars.
IRA, any of the seminars?
Yes, mainly
So
all
I
of it's
missed
put on
some.
either the Facebook page, IRA Facebook page,
Yeah.
or the IRA website. So it always comes up on there.
So just keep it.
Just those two sources. Yeah. If you're on the page, just click on the notification, so it should notify you as soon as something comes up.
Oh, okay.
But do we have a mailing list of everyone who
Sophie?
attended?
Yeah, we do have a mailing list. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
so-
can we add the?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, we'll add the attendees to the mailing list.
Okay.
Yeah, just so don't.
Okay. Any more points before we start?
Can I just add something to
Of course,
the
yeah.
question of the brother, the second question? Now, just as an outsider who's in the process of studying the Arabic, one thing I realized that really got me to connect with the verses, the ayat of the Qur'an, and sometimes leave me just completely stunned was, if you think back to their time, the companions, one thing they had was they were masters of the language itself. So they knew many of them at least, they knew the in-depth meaning of even the words and the vocabulary that was being used. And while Allah used one word over another word, although it may have roughly the same meaning but slight nuances, but within one context, just because of a subtle difference in the change of word, it just totally has a whole different impact on you. So what I noticed was whenever I would study just sit with say an ayah of the Qur'an and just study one particular ayah and each word of that particular ayah, and study the background of the particular meanings and the shades of different meanings of the word, and then the whole context of that particular ayah, and then just look at it, study it from, like you said, from the micro and then to the macro and work the way out, and eventually it gets to the point where you really understand that verse well. So you look at the tafsir, you look at the vocabulary, you look at the grammatical structure, and then it sometimes hits you really, really deeply from that perspective, because you just get a slight glimpse of what they may have experienced, because this was second nature to them. They understood the grammar, they understood the vocabulary, and when the ayat came for them, that listening from the time it goes into your ears to the time it impacts, it was just immediate. But for us, because maybe, and I think most of even the Arab brothers, one of the things is they know the language, but they don't study it to a depth. Because there's so many other languages that you have you have modern standard now, and it's become almost classical. Yeah, it's not a point of study. So that really, for me personally, that was a really helped me a lot.
Is there a tafsir book that basically brings it all together for you? Because I find it Kathir goes to the history and what the Abbas and his students used to have to say about each particular ayah. What you're saying is that you look into each word. Is there a particular book of tafsir that gives you this?
No, for me. So with me, I use a few different books to try to achieve that effect. So for example, mainly I use the books or the language I study in is Urdu normally, because they have after Arabic. English is very far behind as far as what's been translated, but Urdu has a lot of stuff translated. So Mufradat al-Qur'an by Raghab al. No, it's the dictionary, Quranic dictionary.
Oh,
Raghib al-Asfahani. Yeah, that one. That's brilliant because he breaks down the verse and he it's almost like a dictionary tafsir of the verse itself. So that's really powerful. Ibn Kathir obviously for general context. And then just a few other Qurtubi and all the others. So just get a mix of different tafsirs and some dictionary-based tafsirs and just do it like that. And then obviously after that you've got just other normal, regular dictionaries of the Qur'an. In English you've got one by Abdul Halim as well now that we refer to sometimes. And Lane's lexicon. So those 3 or 4 different sources. Obviously you have the Arabic, mashallah, so you'll have access to so much more, inshallah.
No, I'm not that level. Like you say, just like spoken Arabic, like we are today. The Arabic language is not like it used to be as well.
I think
the modern
it's
standard doesn't come as close as the Quranic Arabic. Even the Fusha doesn't come as close as the Quranic.
Yeah. It's just, I think that just that process of spending time and the effort as well with the verse or the ayah is it just.
What I found was if you take an ayah and repeat it like 3, 4, even 10 times, it gives you more.
Yeah.
There's this Imam that I prayed with in Saudi Arabia. It's in Khamis Mushaykh near Abha. It's near this. His name is Ahmed al-Hawashi. He's also Qari. his salah is like an hour and a half. Isha is an hour and a half. So he repeats in that ayah 3-4 times. The whole masjid is crying. The amount of khushu' because. And when I prayed with him, he read Surah Sajda, it was a Fajr, so Sajda and Halata al Insan. So he kept repeating, Inna khalaqna al-insan he repeated like 5 times. And inside me, I was like, oh my God, this is why Allah gave us his him and I to listen, to listen carefully. It's amazing. So like it's a repetition, it works, and I've seen it works. It works for me, and it works.
Surah Insan.
No, the way he was repeating each ayah, and he was repeating it 3-4 times, and that was when it was hitting the people in the heart and in the mind, and they were able to reflect, and the whole masjid would cry. He's actually known for this. He's an old man, like nearly 90. But his salah, he also has a book called the Salatul Khashia, the salah which has for sure.
It's our attention spans as well, isn't it? You just find it hard to focus these days.
It's connecting with Allah as well, like you have to want to feel that inspiration from what you read, because I remember when I first converted and I'm just reading in English and just pick it up regularly and just pray to Allah that He gives you that inspiration. Even from English you can get it. I think it's connecting and seeking that help and the connection from Allah when you read, because like you said, there's plenty of people who can speak and know Arabic to such an extent. How do you get that inspiration? You have to seek it from Allah.
The distractions also actually, because of maybe at the time of Prophet Muhammad, there wasn't a lot of distractions. So it was even for the kuffar, it was between the asnam, the idols, and their probably trade, which wasn't too much of it. Okay, there wasn't too much of it, and with this like powerful Qur'an. Whereas today we are thinking about a lot, too much, study-wise, work-wise, family-wise, going to the beach or playing football, friends, and this and that. So it's the disconnect. I think.
I think based on what you're talking about and what the brother was saying in terms of future talks, I think the Qur'an is obviously referred to as being the best dhikr, and maybe, I don't know, again, this could be a topic in and of itself. Why is the Qur'an the best dhikr? Why should one read it often? What are the benefits? And what are the transformations that come about in one's life as a result of that close connection with the Qur'an? And I think, I don't know, has this been discussed enough? Or has this been discussed in a way that makes it more relevant to people in the 21st century in a Western society? Maybe it has been expressed from the point of view of experiences of people in history in the past. And why is the Qur'an a great dhikr? Maybe this has been discussed from the point of view of the internal beauty of the Qur'an and how it might have an effect on you internally. But maybe what hasn't been really explained is how having a close connection with the Qur'an then impacts your life.
Sure.
That link maybe is something that we can discuss.
So just to mention a couple of things regarding the linguistic stuff, in Arabic at least, some of the books that I've come across which I find really beneficial is by Fadl Samarai. He's very good. Nu'man Ali Khan takes a lot of his stuff from Fadl Samarai. Then also from a tafsir perspective is Ibn Ashur. I've actually done a whole session on how to make tadabbur of Qur'an. I don't think it's actually within the remit of IRA. And one of the things is actually repetition. One of the ways that you actually try to come closer to the Qur'an is just keep repeating something, and then you actually find some lesson or some benefit you could take from the verse that you never thought of before. In terms of connecting, there's actually a couple of good books that we've written on this topic in the English language. There's one which is called The Way to the Qur'an by, what's his name, Khurram Murad. It's a very small book, but it's really powerful. I find it to be really good. And he talks about how you can actually approach the Qur'an, how to connect with the Qur'an.
By who?
Khurram Murad, I think his name is Khurram Murad. Yeah. A very famous book. It's got blue, I think it's got a blue cover. Then also another book which I found really beneficial, which is really good as well, and how to connect with the Qur'an. It's called How to Approach the Qur'an by Jamaluddin Zaragoza, and that's also a very, very good book. He actually talks about how we should actually approach the Qur'an from different perspectives, how often we should read it, what the scholar said about this, the different steps on connecting with the Qur'an and so on and so forth. It's actually a very unique book that he's written, and I think he did a lot of research to write this book. So yeah, those two particular books I think are very beneficial on how to connect better with the Qur'an. They give you some very good techniques as well.
What was the first name that you did for the Faris?
Fadil Samarani. Dr. Fadil Samarani. So he's written many books talking about the balagha of the Qur'an, and he's very, like, for example, Allah says, why does he say in Surah Al-Baqarah, in Fajarat, and why does he mention Surah Al-A'raf? In Bajasat, yeah. Why does it, and they're talking about the same thing, which is the story of Musa alayhi salam, and when he hit the ground and it turned into a well, why did he mention in Fajarat here, in Bajasat in the other surah? And it's really interesting, very powerful. He's written some very good books in this topic. Any more questions, points? We'll make that the last one. No? Okay, inshallah. So, Jazakallah khair for all attending. Do we know when our next specialist course is?
No, but it'll be next month, so we'll put it out 2 weeks before the course itself, inshallah. So by the second week of next month or mid next month, you'll get a notification on the website, inshallah.
No.
Ah,